Is this not Ngozi, the barren woman? What happened? Her triplets look so beautiful. God, when?
Tunde thought he had everything under control. Wealth, a beautiful new fiancée, and a perfect life. But when he invited his ex-wife, Ngozi, to his wedding with the sole intention of humiliating her, he never imagined she would show up in a Rolls-Royce with her 3 stunning triplet sons, fathered by another man. The truth was about to be exposed, and Tunde's life would never be the same again. Welcome back, my incredible family and friends. If you enjoy stories that stir your soul and stay with you long after they're over, make sure to smash that subscribe button and drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I've got another gripping story lined up for you tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now let's get started. Tunde's office was pristine, with polished wood floors and glass walls offering a panoramic view of Lagos's bustling skyline. The air was thick with the hum of high-end equipment, the scent of expensive cologne, and the constant buzz of calls and deals. Tunde was a man who commanded respect, a wealthy businessman with fingers in nearly every pie: construction, real estate, tech, and more. Yet beneath his calm and calculated exterior, there was a simmering discontent. His life, although picture-perfect on the outside, was a tale of broken dreams and hidden resentments. At 43, Tunde had everything he ever dreamed of: an empire, a fleet of luxury cars, an exquisite mansion in the heart of Lekki, and an enviable lifestyle. But someone, had been missing for the longest time: a child. He had married Ngozi 7 years ago. They had been the picture of a perfect couple: Tunde, the successful businessman, and Ngozi, his charming, radiant wife. But their marriage was not without strain. What once was a love story full of promise slowly turned into a silent battleground. The one thing they wanted most, children, eluded them, and Tunde began to grow impatient. Tunde had been the one to push for IVF treatments, and despite the hope they both held, there was no baby. He blamed Ngozi. Deep down, he couldn't accept the possibility that the problem might be with him. After all, a man like Tunde, successful and revered, could not be the one who was incapable. It was always easier to point the finger. He told himself that Ngozi's inability to conceive was the final straw. If she can't give me children, what else does she have to offer, he thought. Eventually, he filed for divorce, citing her inability to bear children as the reason for the split. He couldn't even look at her without seeing failure. In his eyes, Ngozi had failed him, and he had to cut her out of his life. Ngozi's life was nothing like Tunde's. She lived in a modest apartment in a quiet corner of the city, far from the luxury and fame that came with being Tunde's wife. She had been raised in a humble home where love was always abundant, but money was scarce. But she had dreams that had been crushed over time, particularly by the pain of not being able to give her husband the one thing he wanted most: a child. After the divorce, she was left with nothing but the broken pieces of a marriage that had once been her everything. She had lost her home, her status, and her dignity. Every day, she wrestled with the feeling of failure, the weight of being blamed for something she could not control. Her heart was torn, not just because of the loss of her marriage, but because of the loss of the future she had imagined with Tunde. Yet there was something inside her that refused to break completely. She had moments of deep sorrow, of crying herself to sleep, but there was a glimmer of hope in her heart. A hope she had to nurture, if only for herself. She knew she had to move forward, but where to start? It was during one of these low points that she met Amara. Amara was a close friend from college, the one person who had always stood by Ngozi. She had been the first to reach out after the divorce and offered her home as a sanctuary. Amara had been a constant source of support, always there with a kind word, a shoulder to cry on, and most importantly, a dose of tough love. Amara, a successful marketing executive, had always been the one to push Ngozi to be more, to take risks, to look beyond the pain. When Ngozi mentioned that she had been to several fertility specialists and had failed every time, Amara didn't just listen. She took action. "You need a full checkup, Ngozi," Amara insisted one afternoon while they sat in a cafe in Victoria Island. "You don't know what's going on with your body until you see a specialist who really cares." At first, Ngozi was reluctant. She had been to doctors before, but the memories of failure were still too fresh. However, Amara was persistent, and after much cajoling, Ngozi agreed. The tests came back a week later, and the results were a shock. Ngozi was perfectly healthy. There were no fertility issues on her end. Her body was capable of carrying a child without any complications. She had been blaming herself for all those years, but the truth was something she had never suspected. The problem was with Tunde, not her. The revelation was both empowering and painful. Empowering because, for the first time in years, Ngozi could feel a sense of validation. But painful because it meant that Tunde had never really looked for answers. He had given up on her without truly understanding the situation. Ngozi didn't know how to feel about the truth at first. She had been living in the shadow of Tunde's blame, but now she had the truth on her side. It was the moment she decided that her life had to go on, regardless of what had happened. Months passed, and Tunde moved on with his life. He had found a new fiancée, Chika, a beautiful woman from a wealthy family who had all the qualities he had always wanted in a wife. However, there was one lingering issue. He still wasn't able to conceive. He had moved on from Ngozi, but the desire for a child haunted him. Tunde had started planning a grand wedding, one that would be talked about for years to come. But deep down, he wanted something more from this wedding. He wanted to humiliate Ngozi in front of everyone. He wanted to prove to her that she had failed him, and that his new life with Chika was everything she could never provide. He invited Ngozi to the wedding, knowing full well the impact it would have on her. He thought he was doing her a favor by giving her an invitation to witness his new life. What he didn't know was that Ngozi wasn't the same woman anymore. Meanwhile, Ngozi was slowly but surely rebuilding her life. With Amara's encouragement, she had started a small food business, baking delicious pastries and offering catering services to local events. She had found peace in this work, and soon her business began to grow. Her days were no longer filled with self-doubt or despair. She was no longer the woman who had been abandoned. She was a woman who had found her own way. But as Tunde's wedding approached, something inside her stirred. She had no intention of attending, but there was a small voice in her head telling her she needed to see the truth for herself. She needed to see the man who had humiliated her, who had thrown her away, living the life he thought he deserved. The invitation arrived, and it didn't take long for Ngozi to make up her mind. She was going to attend. She was going to show Tunde just how wrong he had been, not just for the way he treated her, but for the assumptions he had made about her worth. Tunde had spared no expense in planning the wedding. The venue was a grand hotel on Victoria Island, adorned with golden chandeliers, silk drapes, and tables dressed in white linen. Everything was set to be nothing short of spectacular. His guests, a mix of the city's elite, whispered in excitement as they arrived. The air was thick with anticipation for the grand union between Tunde and Chika. Tunde, standing at the altar, was a picture of confidence. His sleek black tuxedo fit him perfectly, and his face wore the expression of a man who had everything under control. Beside him stood Chika, radiant in a white satin gown that shimmered under the soft glow of the chandeliers. She was beautiful, poised, and exactly what Tunde had wanted. A woman who complemented his wealth, status, and power. But even in this perfect moment, Tunde's mind was elsewhere. It wasn't on Chika, his bride-to-be, but on the woman sitting quietly in the back, with her 3 young children by her side. Ngozi had arrived, just as Tunde expected, but not in the way he had anticipated. When she walked through the grand entrance, the room fell silent. Her entrance was nothing like what Tunde had imagined. No tears, no meekness, just a woman walking in with pride. Ngozi, now dressed in a simple yet elegant dress, had arrived in a brand new Rolls-Royce, the sleek black vehicle gleaming under the sunlight as it pulled up in front of the venue. But that wasn't what stunned everyone. It was the 3 children she had with her. 3 perfect, identical triplet boys, no older than 4 years old, their wide smiles and infectious laughter filling the air. Tunde's heart dropped in his chest. The sight of Ngozi, strong, confident, and utterly transformed, was the last thing he expected. His eyes lingered on the triplets, each of them holding onto their mother's hands with innocence and joy. The moment seemed to stretch forever. This wasn't just Ngozi showing up. This was Ngozi with a family, with life, with success. Tunde's chest tightened. He had never imagined that Ngozi would show up like this, not just as the woman he had left behind, but as someone who had moved on. And not only had she moved on, she had thrived. Ngozi walked into the venue with her head held high. Her triplets, Chuka, Chibuzo, and Chijioke, followed her closely, their little shoes tapping rhythmically on the floor. Every eye in the room was on them, but Ngozi didn't falter. She had long since learned the power of walking into a room with confidence, no matter the circumstances. The whispers and gasps of surprise only spurred her forward. She scanned the room briefly, her eyes landing on Tunde at the altar. He looked stiff, rigid, as if he had just seen a ghost. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look back. Not now. She was no longer the woman he had discarded. She was a mother, a successful businesswoman, and a woman with a future that didn't revolve around the man who had once been her husband. Ngozi made her way to a seat near the back, taking her place alongside her children. The triplets giggled and pointed at the colorful flowers that adorned the walls, completely unaware of the tension in the air. As they settled in, Ngozi felt the weight of the moment. She was not here to disrupt. She wasn't here to make Tunde regret anything. No, she was here for one reason, to prove to herself that she was enough, that she had always been enough. Chika, who had been standing beside Tunde, couldn't help but notice the transformation in Ngozi. She saw the way the other guests looked at her, with a mix of awe and curiosity. There was no doubt in Chika's mind that this was no ordinary woman. She had something about her, something dignified, something powerful. Tunde, still standing at the altar, tried to regain his composure. His mind raced. Why was she here? What was she trying to prove? He had invited Ngozi to this wedding for one purpose only, to remind her of her place, to show her that he had moved on, and that he had found someone who could give him what she couldn't: children. But now he felt something he hadn't expected, a rush of jealousy and a bitter taste in his mouth. His pride was stinging, and it was hard for him to ignore the small voice in his head telling him that maybe, just maybe, Ngozi had the life he should have had. As the ceremony continued, Tunde's thoughts kept returning to Ngozi. He watched her as she laughed and talked to other guests, her triplets bouncing happily in front of her. He hated that they were so happy, so unaffected by his presence. He hated that they were a reminder of what he could never have with Chika, despite all his wealth and power. Chika, sensing Tunde's unease, reached out and touched his arm gently. "Tunde, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. He snapped back to the present, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice strained. But his eyes never left Ngozi. He had made a mistake by thinking this would be easy. This wasn't just a wedding, this was a confrontation, and it was one that Tunde was not ready for. The reception hall buzzed with chatter, but there was an underlying tension. Ngozi and her triplets remained mostly to themselves, chatting quietly with some guests who had already approached them with curiosity. But Ngozi was unfazed. This was her moment of peace, her moment to show that life had a way of working itself out, even after the darkest storms. Then, as the night went on, something unexpected happened. Chika, who had been silent since the wedding, pulled Tunde aside. "I need to talk to you privately," she said, her tone firm. Tunde followed Chika outside into the cool evening air, the sounds of the celebration muted behind them. "What's going on?" Tunde asked, his voice tense. Chika stood still, crossing her arms. "You never told me about your ex-wife, Tunde," she said, her voice filled with accusation. "You told me she couldn't have children, but now I see her here, with 3 kids. And from what I'm hearing, they're yours, aren't they?" Tunde froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Chika had begun to piece together the truth, and it was unraveling the carefully constructed lie he had built for everyone, including himself. "She was never the problem," Chika continued, her voice softer now. "You were." The shock of that realization hit Tunde hard. Chika wasn't angry with Ngozi. She was angry with him, for deceiving her, for keeping this secret, for playing a part in the hurt he had caused. It was no longer about the wedding, no longer about Ngozi. It was about Tunde facing the lies he had told, not just to Chika, but to himself for years. Tunde spent the rest of the evening in a daze. The opulent celebration around him, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the music seemed distant, like a world he no longer belonged to. He excused himself from the reception, claiming exhaustion, but in truth, he was running away. He needed space, needed time to process the conversation with Chica. Her words echoed in his mind. You were the problem. He wandered through the grand hall, his mind clouded by guilt and anger. Every time he glanced at Ngozi, his emotions twisted in confusion. Part of him wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation for how she had moved on so quickly, so effortlessly. But another part of him, one buried deep down, one he had tried to ignore for years, felt a pang of regret. Had I made the right decision, he wondered? Had I truly left her for the right reasons? Chica's words had shaken him to his core. They had forced him to confront the truth he had been running from. He had never truly accepted his own flaws. Instead, he had placed the blame squarely on Ngozi's shoulders. But now, seeing her with her 3 children, seeing her glowing, confident and unbothered, it was hard to deny the truth that was staring him in the face. Ngozi wasn't the problem. He was. And that realization gnawed at him. Ngozi, on the other hand, was completely at peace with her decision. After the wedding, she had returned to her seat with her triplets, exchanging pleasantries with a few old acquaintances. She felt no bitterness, no anger, only a quiet satisfaction. She had come to this moment not for revenge, but for healing. She had shown up to prove that she was no longer the woman Tunde had left behind. She was stronger now, a woman who had built a life for herself and her children. A life that was better than anything Tunde could have ever offered her. As the evening wore on, Ngozi couldn't help but notice the subtle glances cast her way. Whispers filled the air, some of admiration, others of curiosity. People had seen the Rolls-Royce, the triplets, and their bright smiles, and they knew this wasn't just a woman who had survived a divorce. She had thrived in ways that most people could only dream of. Ngozi's phone buzzed with a message from Amara, her ever-supportive friend. I saw the way people looked at you tonight. They know your worth. I'm so proud of you, Ngozi. She smiled as she read the message. Amara's encouragement had been a constant in her life, and it had helped her reach this moment. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. And as she glanced once more at Tunde, standing by himself near the altar, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. I'm free, she thought. I'm finally free. Tunde sat at the edge of the balcony, staring out at the city below. The night felt suffocating. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of his thoughts. His wedding was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start. Instead, it had become a moment of reckoning. He replayed his conversation with Chica in his mind, the way she had confronted him, her voice trembling with disbelief. It had been hard to hear, but deep down he knew she was right. He had lied to her. He had lied to everyone, including himself. And now, as he looked at the life he had built, it felt hollow. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him out of his thoughts. Chica appeared, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. She had been looking for him, worried about the tension in the air. But seeing him now, lost in his own world, she knew something had shifted. Tunde, she said softly, sitting beside him, we need to talk. He didn't look at her immediately, his eyes still fixed on the lights of the city. I don't know what to say, Chica. I've been living a lie. Chica's heart dropped. She had suspected there was more to the story, but hearing Tunde admit it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. She had loved him, but this man before her was a stranger. You've been living a lie, Chica repeated, her voice trembling. What do you mean? Tunde finally turned to face her, his expression empty. Ngozi, she wasn't the problem. I was. I'm the one who couldn't accept the truth about myself. I've been running from it, blaming her for everything that went wrong in our marriage. But the truth is, I couldn't give her what she wanted either. I couldn't give her a child. Chica recoiled slightly, her face pale. She had never imagined this. Tunde had always seemed so perfect, so in control. But now, in this moment of vulnerability, she saw the cracks in his facade. I thought I was the one with the problem, he continued, his voice strained. But it wasn't her, it was me. I never wanted to face it, Chica. I never wanted to admit that I was the one who failed her. Chica's mind raced as she processed his words. She had been lied to, manipulated into thinking that Ngozi was the issue all along. Now everything was starting to make sense. "Tunde," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How could you? How could you lie to me like that? I thought we were building something real." Back inside the venue, Ngozi watched the exchange between Tunde and Chika from a distance. She could see the way Chika looked at him now, no longer with admiration, but with a deep sense of disappointment. Part of her felt sad for Chika, but another part of her felt an overwhelming sense of justice. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when Tunde would finally face the consequences of his actions. The wedding guests slowly began to filter out, some still talking in hushed tones about the dramatic turn of events. But Ngozi stood tall, her triplets playing nearby, oblivious to the turmoil that had just unfolded. She had come here to show everyone, that she was more than what Tunde had made her feel. She was more than his discarded wife, and in this moment she had proven it. The evening had taken a toll on Tunde, and the emptiness in his chest seemed to grow with every passing minute. The grand wedding he had imagined, the perfect event to mark his new beginning with Chika, had collapsed around him. He couldn't escape the truth. It was as if Ngozi's presence had triggered something he had buried deep inside himself. But now, with Chika's confrontation fresh in his mind, the weight of it all was too much to bear. He had tried to escape earlier, to retreat to the balcony and clear his head, but it hadn't worked. The reality of what had happened was too overwhelming. He couldn't just run from it anymore. He couldn't run from the lies he had told, from the woman he had cast aside, or from the truth he had never wanted to face. Chika stood next to him now, silent. She had been by his side all night, but she hadn't said a word since their conversation. She was still processing the revelations, still trying to come to terms with the man she had thought she knew. It had been a brutal awakening for her, and she wasn't sure where to go from here. Tunde finally turned to her, his voice low and hesitant. "Chika, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you." Chika's eyes flickered with pain. "Then why did you lie to me, Tunde? Why did you let me believe that she was the problem? I trusted you." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly composed herself. She wasn't sure if she was ready to hear any more of his excuses, or if there even were any. "I don't know," Tunde whispered, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know why I did it. I just couldn't face the truth. I thought that if I told you, if I admitted what was really happening, it would make me look weak. I didn't want to look weak, not in front of you or anyone else." Chika shook her head. "Weak? Tunde, this isn't about weakness. It's about honesty. It's about trust. And I thought we had that. I thought we were building something real." For a moment there was silence between them, the kind of silence that carried the weight of everything unspoken, everything broken. Tunde's mind raced, but he couldn't come up with the words to fix what had been shattered. His world was falling apart, and the woman who had once stood beside him was now questioning everything he had ever believed about their relationship. Meanwhile, Ngozi was far from the drama that had unfolded behind the scenes. As the evening drew to a close, she gathered her children and prepared to leave the venue. The triplets, still full of energy, tugged at her dress, eager to go home. Ngozi, however, felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had come to this place as a woman in search of closure, and she had found it. But there was no rush to leave. She lingered, watching the guests trickle out, and felt a calm certainty settle over her. She had done what she needed to do. She had proven, not to anyone else but to herself, that she was capable of moving forward. She had built a life. She had 3 beautiful children who were the product of her new life. A life far removed from the man who had abandoned her. As she stood near the door, Amara's voice broke through the buzz of the departing guests. "Ngozi, wait up!" Amara rushed over to her, smiling brightly as always. She had been watching from a distance, quietly observing the way people had reacted to Ngozi's presence. "You did it," Amara said with a grin. "You showed them. You showed them all." Ngozi smiled, but shook her head. "It wasn't about showing them, Amara. It was about showing myself. I needed to see the truth for what it was." Amara nodded, understanding. She had seen Ngozi's journey from the very beginning. She knew that this moment was a long time coming. "Well, you've done more than that." You've proven that your worth isn't tied to anyone else's approval. Back at the wedding, Tunde and Chika stood in the same spot, both uncertain of where they stood now. The night was winding down, and the last of the guests were beginning to leave. But Tunde could still feel the presence of Ngozi lingering in the air like an unresolved chord. Chika stood beside him, her gaze distant. She had been quiet for too long, and Tunde knew the silence meant something more than just confusion. "I think we need to talk," Chika said softly, breaking the stillness. "Not here, not now, but soon." Tunde nodded, but he knew deep down that their conversation would have to be more than just words. He had hurt her, and the damage was done. He could see it in her eyes now, the hurt, the disappointment. He wasn't sure if he could ever fix it. "I understand," he replied, his voice hollow. "I'll do whatever it takes, Chika. I never meant for any of this to happen." Chika met his eyes then, her expression resolute. "It's not just about what you meant, Tunde. It's about what you did. You broke something, and I'm not sure if it can ever be fixed." Tunde stood there, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long building an image of himself, of the life he thought he deserved. But in a single evening, that image had crumbled piece by piece. He had thought he was in control, that he could manipulate the situation in his favor. But now he saw the truth. There was no escaping it. The cracks in his facade were too wide to hide. As Chika walked away, Tunde stood still for a moment longer, his thoughts racing. The evening had started as a celebration, a victory. But it had turned into a reckoning, one that he wasn't prepared for. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his actions had consequences far beyond what he could have ever imagined. He glanced toward the exit where Ngozi had left, her triplets still in tow. The sight of her had shaken him, but now he understood why. She had found a life, a family, a future, without him. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't been able to admit before. He was the one who had lost everything. The evening stretched on, but Tunde felt a growing heaviness in his chest. The wedding was over. The guests had gone, and the venue had started to empty out. Yet he could not shake the feeling of emptiness that had crept into his life. Chika had gone home, her expression distant and unreadable. And Ngozi, the woman he had discarded, was out of his reach, leaving him with a deep, gnawing sense of regret. Tunde spent the night alone in his hotel suite, replaying the events of the day in his mind. Every moment of the evening, the lavish decorations, the sounds of laughter, and the vows he had exchanged with Chika seemed hollow now. He had been so focused on proving to everyone, including Ngozi, that he had moved on. But in reality, all he had done was build a house of cards, each one fragile, each one now crumbling. As the morning light filtered through the curtains, Tunde sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts racing. He could no longer avoid the truth. He had hurt people, Chika, Ngozi, himself. But the most painful part was the truth about himself. The man who had once prided himself on his control, on his ability to manipulate situations, was now powerless. He had pushed away the woman who had loved him, the woman who had been there for him when he needed her most. And now she was living a life without him. A better life. Ngozi, meanwhile, had returned to her apartment with the triplets. The kids were happily playing with their toys in the living room, completely unaware of the complexity of the emotions swirling around their mother. Ngozi had already settled into a quiet routine in her life. Her business was thriving, and her days were filled with the joyful chaos of raising 3 energetic boys. Yet even with all the success she had found, a part of her couldn't shake the memories of her marriage to Tunde. She sat in the kitchen, sipping tea, as she thought about everything that had transpired. She had walked into that wedding, not to prove a point to Tunde or anyone else, but to prove it to herself. She had needed to show that she was more than what they had believed her to be. But now, as she reflected, she realized something important. She had done it. She had built a life without Tunde. She had triumphed, not just over him, but over the pain and the lies. Yet she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for what had been lost. Her marriage, her dreams, the family they had once envisioned together, none of it had turned out the way she had hoped. But in that moment, she also understood something deeper. Her worth had never been tied to Tunde. It had never been about whether or not she could give him children. It had always been about her own strength, her own resilience. And that strength had carried her to this point. The next few days were filled with tension for both Tunde and Chika. The awkward silence between them stretched on, each moment filled with unspoken words and unresolved questions. Chika had tried to reach out, but Tunde had withdrawn. He needed to process everything, but he wasn't sure how to face her or even where to begin. Chika had always prided herself on being rational, on knowing what she wanted. But now she felt uncertain, lost in the confusion of Tunde's deception. She had tried so hard to build a life with him, but now she saw the cracks in the foundation. The lies had started small, but over time they had built up into something much larger. And now she wondered if it was all too broken to fix. It wasn't just about the lies anymore. It was about the betrayal of trust, about the years that had been wasted, about the future that seemed impossible to imagine with someone who had failed to be honest with her. Chika was a woman of strength, but she knew her limits. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that their relationship could be salvaged. She had to confront Tunde, but she didn't know if he was ready to face the truth, or if he even cared enough to try. A few days later, Tunde found himself at Ngozi's bakery. It had been months since he'd seen her, but he couldn't shake the pull to speak to her. He had to face her. He had to confront the truth about his mistakes. As he entered the small shop, the warm scent of freshly baked bread and pastries filled the air, and for a moment he felt a wave of nostalgia. Ngozi was behind the counter, arranging some pastries, and she looked up as he entered. Her expression remained neutral, though there was a hint of surprise in her eyes. Tunde wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps anger, perhaps disdain. But what he saw instead was a quiet strength. She had become someone unrecognizable to him. The woman who had once begged him to stay, to try again, was now someone who stood tall, confident and independent. Tunde took a hesitant step forward. "Ngozi, I need to talk to you." She didn't say anything at first, merely glanced at him with a quiet patience. She had already moved on from the pain of the past. She had forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own. But hearing him speak now, after all that had happened, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it pity, regret, or maybe something else? "About what?" she asked calmly, her voice steady. She wasn't angry, but there was a coolness to her tone. Tunde sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had never been good at admitting his faults. He had always been the one in control, the one who made decisions, the one who could manipulate the outcome. But now, standing here, in the presence of the woman he had hurt, he realized how much he had lost. "I've made a mess of things, Ngozi," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I've lied to myself for so long. I thought I could just move on, but I can't. I can't move on from what I've done to you. From what I've done to us." Ngozi looked at him for a long moment before responding, her gaze unwavering. "Tunde," she began softly, "I don't know what you want from me, but I'm not the woman you left behind. I've moved on, and I've built a life without you." Tunde's heart sank at her words. They were simple, direct, and final. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of the truth. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I should have never left you. I should have never believed the lie. You deserved so much more than what I gave you." Tunde left Ngozi's bakery that day with a heavy heart. Her words echoed in his mind like an unrelenting drumbeat. And despite the emptiness he felt, he couldn't shake the sense of admiration for her strength. He had come to the bakery seeking closure, perhaps some absolution for the wrongs he had committed, but he left with nothing but the harsh reality of his own failures. He spent the following days in a haze, moving through his business meetings and obligations like a ghost. Chika had moved out of their shared apartment, giving him space to think. He found himself missing her, not because he loved her, but because he was beginning to realize that she had been a symbol of everything he had tried to build in the last few years. A life of perfection, wealth, and power. But now it was all a facade. Chika, meanwhile, was staying with a close friend in the city, trying to make sense of everything. The betrayal still stung, but she had come to a quiet conclusion. She could never go back to Tunde. He had betrayed her trust in a way that left no room for reconciliation. The The manipulation and the ongoing deceit were too much for her to overlook. But there was something else. She couldn't ignore the growing feelings of uncertainty about herself. Her worth had always been tied to her relationships, to the people around her. But now she was forced to reckon with her own identity, separate from Tunde. In the quiet of her friend's apartment, she began to think more about her future. She had always put herself second, always allowed others, particularly Tunde, to define her. But now she had the opportunity to redefine herself. She didn't need Tunde. She had her own career, her own dreams, and it was time to focus on those. As the days passed, Tunde found himself gravitating towards the one place that felt like a lifeline, his office. He buried himself in his work, trying to fill the void with the familiar hum of deals, projects, and phone calls. But even in his busy schedule, his mind often wandered back to Ngozi. He realized with a sinking feeling that she had become something far beyond the woman he had once known. She had built a life for herself, a life that was rich in love, purpose, and success. Tunde tried to tell himself that he had made the right choice, that his decision to leave Ngozi was justified. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had been running away from his own flaws, and in doing so, he had lost the only person who had truly mattered. He had tried to move on, to replace the hole she had left in his heart with another woman. But no matter how many high-profile relationships he had, no matter how many business successes he could claim, none of it filled the void that Ngozi had once filled. He realized that he had never truly loved Chika. He had loved the idea of her, the life she represented. But what he had never understood was that real love, the kind of love he had once shared with Ngozi, was built on something far deeper than surface-level perfection. Ngozi, on the other hand, was thriving. Her business had grown exponentially in the past few months, and she was finally starting to believe in herself again. The triplets, Chuka, Chibuzo, and Chijioke, were growing stronger and smarter each day, and their laughter filled the apartment with warmth. They had become the light of her life, and she realized that in many ways they had been the ones to heal her. Her food business, which had started with small orders and local catering, had now expanded to corporate clients. She was booked for events, her signature pastries in high demand. She felt proud of what she had achieved. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the independence, the ability to stand on her own 2 feet without relying on anyone else. One evening, as Ngozi sat in her small kitchen, preparing a new batch of pastries for an upcoming event, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was a message from Amara. "Tunde called me today. He wants to talk." Ngozi froze. Tunde. She hadn't heard from him since the wedding. Part of her felt curious about what he had to say, but another part of her recoiled at the thought of him trying to worm his way back into her life. She had come too far to let him undo all the progress she had made. Still, she couldn't ignore the message. She had made peace with her past, but this was a new chapter. And perhaps it was time to close the old one for good. The next day, Tunde stood in front of Ngozi's bakery once more, his palms sweating. This time, he had come with a different purpose. No longer did he seek to manipulate, to control the narrative. He had spent days, weeks, even months thinking about what he had done, about the way he had treated her. And he knew that the only thing that could offer him any peace now was the truth. He walked in and Ngozi looked up, her expression neutral. She didn't speak immediately, waiting for him to say something. Her calm demeanor had changed him. Tunde had never known this woman, the one who stood before him now. This version of Ngozi who had grown into herself, independent and strong. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Tunde began, his voice sincere, though it cracked with emotion. "About what I did to you. I've been selfish. I've blamed you for things that weren't your fault, and I've hurt you in ways that I can't take back." Ngozi remained silent for a moment, processing his words. Part of her wanted to shout at him, to unleash all the years of pain and frustration she had buried deep inside. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there, holding the tray of pastries she had just prepared, her calm presence a stark contrast to the turmoil Tunde felt inside. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, her voice steady but firm, "but I have forgiven myself. I had to, or I would have been stuck forever in the same cycle of pain. I can't go back to the woman I was before, Tunde. I'm not her anymore. Tunde nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this truth hit him harder than anything else. She had forgiven herself. And in doing so, she had freed herself from the chains he had placed around her. Later that day, as Tunde left the bakery, he realized that the closure he had been seeking wasn't something Ngozi could give him. It was something he had to give himself. He had to come to terms with his own mistakes, and he had to understand that the past could not be changed. But there was one thing he could change: how he moved forward. As he got into his car and drove away, he looked at the city around him. It was bustling with life, with people making their way through their own struggles, their own triumphs. He was no different. He was just another man trying to find his way in a world that didn't always make sense. And for the first time in a long while, Tunde understood that he was not in control. Life was unpredictable, but the one thing he could control was how he chose to live. The days following his visit to Ngozi's bakery felt like a blur to Tunde. He had hoped that confronting his past, admitting his faults, would somehow bring him peace. But instead it only deepened his sense of loss. The weight of the truth, the betrayal, the hurt he had caused felt unbearable. The shame lingered, wrapping itself around him tighter with each passing moment. Chika had not responded to his attempts to reach out. He had left messages, sent texts, but there was nothing. She had packed up and left, without a word. He couldn't blame her, but the silence between them was suffocating. Tunde was accustomed to power, to control, but now for the first time in his life, he felt completely powerless. Chika's absence in his apartment was a constant reminder of the distance he had created. The bed was empty, the space around him hollow. Every inch of the luxurious apartment felt like a prison, a cage of his own making. His phone sat on the table, untouched. He hadn't called anyone from his business team, hadn't even checked his emails. His empire, his wealth, seemed irrelevant now. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that all the money in the world couldn't fix the mess he had created in his personal life. Tunde had thought that wealth could solve everything. If something went wrong, he could buy his way out. If people didn't like him, he could charm them. But now, with nothing but his own guilt to face, he understood just how flawed his thinking had been. He had built his life on lies, and now it was all crumbling. At the same time, Ngozi was thriving. Her business had expanded even further, and she had hired a small team to help with the growing demand. The triplets, now 5 years old, were beginning school soon, and the excitement in their household was palpable. Ngozi had become a pillar of strength, not just for herself, but for her children. She no longer thought about Tunde or the pain he had caused her. It wasn't that she had completely forgotten. She had just learned to live with it, to rise above it. She had found a sense of fulfillment in her work, in the love she had for her children, and in the support she received from Amara and others around her. Life had finally begun to feel like it was hers, fully and completely. But that wasn't to say there weren't moments when the past would creep back in. One evening, as she sat at the kitchen table, going through some business paperwork, the phone buzzed in her hand. It was a message from Amara. Tunde reached out to me again. He's still trying to make amends. I think you should know. Ngozi paused, her pen stilling in midair. For a moment, she simply stared at the screen as the weight of Amara's words sunk in. Part of her felt indifference, a sense of finality. She had moved on. She had made peace with the past, but there was another part of her, something deep inside, that wanted to know more. Why was he reaching out now? Tunde sat in his office, staring out the window at the city that he had conquered, the empire he had built. But in this moment, it felt hollow, like a set of walls and glass that could no longer shield him from the truth. He had spent years building an image of perfection, an image of success, but it had all come crashing down. Chika was gone. His relationship with her was irreparably broken. And Ngozi, the woman he had once cast aside, had moved on and built a life that was flourishing without him. Tunde had spent the last few days trying to come up with an explanation, a reason, something that would make his actions seem justified. But he knew deep down that no explanation could fix the harm he had caused. No amount of money, no grand gesture, no apology could undo the years of hurt, the betrayal. He had to face the fact that he had pushed away the one person who had truly loved him. And now, he was left with nothing. One afternoon, as he walked through the busy streets of Lagos, Tunde found himself near a familiar place, Ngozi's bakery. His heart pounded in his chest, and without even thinking, he walked inside. The warmth of the space greeted him, the scent of fresh pastries filling the air. Ngozi was behind the counter, talking to one of her employees. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore an apron with a smile that radiated warmth and confidence. It was as if the woman he had once known had completely transformed into someone new, someone stronger, more self-assured. Tunde stood still for a moment, watching her. He couldn't deny the admiration he felt for her. She had done what he thought was impossible. She had moved on. She had built a life, and she had done it all without him. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she didn't react with anger or surprise. She simply raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "You're here," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What do you want?" "Tunde?" Tunde hesitated. He had expected some form of confrontation, some harsh words. But instead, he felt a sense of clarity. He realized finally that he couldn't change the past. All he could do was own up to his mistakes. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I know I've hurt you, Ngozi, and I don't expect anything from you. I just needed to say that I'm sorry for everything." There was a long silence between them as Ngozi simply looked at him. Tunde didn't know what he expected from her, but as he watched her face, he saw no signs of anger or resentment. Instead, there was something else, something he had never seen before. She sighed deeply and nodded. "You've apologized, Tunde, and that's all you can do. But it doesn't change anything. I've moved on. And I've built a life for myself and my children." Tunde swallowed hard. I know I can't fix what's broken, but I had to say it." Ngozi gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've said it. Now it's time for both of us to move forward." As Tunde left the bakery, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something right. He had faced the truth, apologized, and accepted that his past mistakes were his to carry. The future, however, was something he could still shape. The days following Tunde's visit to Ngozi's bakery were some of the hardest he had ever endured. There was no instant resolution, no quick fix to the years of deceit, betrayal, and pain he had caused. He had apologized, and Ngozi had acknowledged it. But the weight of his actions still loomed over him like a storm cloud. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late for redemption, that his past mistakes were insurmountable. Tunde threw himself into work, but even his empire, once a source of pride and satisfaction, felt like a hollow shell. He had spent his entire life building wealth, collecting assets, and creating a name for himself, but now it all seemed irrelevant. What was the point of all this success when his personal life was in ruins? What good was it to be a wealthy man if he had no one to share it with? Chika had not returned. Their brief and painful conversation had been the final break in their relationship. Tunde had hoped that some part of her might forgive him, that they could rebuild what they had lost, but he knew deep down that she was right to walk away. He had failed her, and now all he could do was live with the consequences. But it wasn't just Chika's absence that haunted him. It was the emptiness that came from knowing he had lost Ngozi too. He had abandoned her once, thinking he could find someone better, someone who could fulfill his desires, someone who would give him the life he had always imagined. But in the end, it was Ngozi who had found her strength, her independence, and her peace. She had proven that she didn't need him. She was better off without him. As the weeks passed, Tunde found himself in a constant state of internal conflict. His business was still thriving, but he couldn't escape the feelings of guilt and shame that clung to him like a second skin. He had alienated the people who had truly mattered, and now he was left with nothing but his own self-loathing. One afternoon, as he sat in his office staring at his laptop, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Tunde," Chika's voice rang through the door, and for a brief moment his heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, but there she was, standing at the entrance of his office. She looked different. There was a calmness to her, a clarity that hadn't been there before. but her eyes were guarded, distant. "Tunde," she repeated, her voice softer now. "Can we talk?" He stood up slowly, unsure of what to expect. "Chica, No," she interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because I need closure. And maybe you do too." Tunde nodded, his throat tight. He had thought the silence between them would last forever, but now, here she was. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, if he was ready to hear what she had to say. But at the same time, he knew this was something he needed. They sat down together in the sleek modern chairs of his office, the air thick with tension. Chica looked at him, searching his face for something. Maybe for remorse, maybe for answers. "I've thought a lot about us, Tunde," she began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "About the lies, about everything that's happened. I was angry at first, but now I'm just tired. I don't want to live with that anger anymore." Tunde looked down, his hands shaking slightly as he clasped them together. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Chica. I know that. I've hurt you and I've hurt Ngozi. I've spent my life building walls around me, walls that kept me from seeing the truth. I was so focused on success, on control, that I never stopped to ask myself if I was doing the right thing. And I wasn't. Chica looked at him for a long time before speaking again. "I'm not here to make excuses for you, Tunde, but I can see that you're finally facing what you did. And that's the first step. You're acknowledging your mistakes. That's something." Tunde's eyes welled with tears as he met her gaze. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I wish I could undo the damage I've done." For a long moment, Chica didn't say anything. The silence between them was thick, but not in the way it had been before. It was different now. The weight of everything they had been through was finally settling into the space between them, and for the first time in a long time, Tunde felt like he could breathe. Finally, Chica spoke again. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Tunde, not yet, but I think you're on the right path, and maybe one day you'll make it right. Maybe not with me, but with yourself. But it's too late for us. We can't go back." Tunde swallowed hard. He had known this was coming. He had known that their relationship could never be salvaged. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing the finality in her voice, was like a sharp slap to his soul. He had lost her. He had lost everything. Later that evening, after Chica had left, Tunde stood at the window of his office, staring out at the skyline. The city, with all its lights and noise, felt distant and cold. He had spent so many years climbing, trying to reach the top, to be the man everyone respected. But now, with everything he had built crumbling around him, he realized just how empty it all was. The money, the power, the status, it meant nothing. Not without the people who mattered. For the first time, Tunde allowed himself to truly feel the weight of his actions. The guilt, the remorse, the shame, it all hit him in waves. He had taken everything for granted. And now, there was nothing left but the consequences of his choices. But there was one thing Tunde still had, his ability to change. He had no idea what the future would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, trying to rebuild the trust he had broken. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be quick, but it was the only path forward. Tunde woke up early the following morning, his mind still a whirlwind of thoughts. It had been a restless night, filled with regret and the heavy burden of everything he had lost. The conversation with Chica had left him feeling hollow, but it had also given him a strange sense of clarity. He couldn't change the past, no matter how hard he tried, but he could control what happened next. He could rebuild, but only if he truly embraced the pain of his mistakes. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light across the city. Tunde sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the view outside his window. He had once seen the world through the lens of success and control, but now all he saw was the emptiness that came from losing everything he thought mattered. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Amara, Ngozi's friend. Tunde had heard a lot about Amara over the years, but he had never truly understood the depth of her friendship with Ngozi. Until now. Ngozi's going to be at the charity event tonight. She's bringing her triplets. and I think it's time you face the truth about what you've done. She's moved on, Tunde, and you need to accept that. Tunde read the message twice. He knew what this meant. It was time for him to truly face the consequences of his actions, time to confront the woman he had hurt so deeply. And this time, it wasn't about apologizing or seeking redemption. It was about acknowledging the truth, about understanding that Ngozi had a life now, a life without him. The charity event was being held at a beautiful venue in the heart of the city. The atmosphere was elegant and filled with the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the soft notes of a live band in the background. Tunde arrived early, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his face a mask of calm. But inside, his heart was pounding. Tonight wasn't just about philanthropy. It was about facing the woman he had wronged and accepting the life she had built without him. He hadn't expected to feel this nervous. But as he stepped inside the venue, his eyes immediately landed on Ngozi. She was standing across the room talking with a few guests. Her presence was striking, commanding attention without even trying. She had grown into someone he didn't recognize, someone he couldn't ever imagine losing. And yet he had. She wasn't the fragile woman he had once known. She was strong, confident, radiant even. Her triplets were beside her, as lively and joyful as always, and they seemed to light up the room with their infectious energy. Tunde watched them for a moment, unable to tear his eyes away. They were the living proof of everything he had lost, everything he had overlooked. He took a deep breath and walked toward her. Ngozi caught sight of Tunde as he approached. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She had moved on from the anger, the hurt, but seeing him still stirred something inside her. It wasn't anger anymore, but a quiet, resigned understanding. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, and seeing him now only reinforced the distance between them. When Tunde reached her, he paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. Words had always been his weapon, his way of controlling situations. But now, in front of the woman he had wronged, he was at a loss. Goi, he began, but the name felt strange on his lips. It had been so long since he'd called her that, since he had said anything at all that mattered. Ngozi smiled faintly, but it wasn't the smile of the woman he had once known. This one was different, gentler but colder, as if the years of pain had taught her to protect her heart. Tunde, she said softly, her voice calm but firm, "It's good to see you." There was no bitterness, no harsh words, just a quiet acknowledgement of the past and the present. Tunde swallowed, struggling to find the right words. I don't know how to start. I've made so many mistakes, and I can't undo them. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything I did. For leaving you. For blaming you when it was my fault. Ngozi looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. There was a flicker of something. Perhaps empathy. Perhaps pity. But no anger. She had let go of the anger a long time ago. "I've already forgiven you, Tunde," she said quietly, "not for your sake, but for mine. Holding on to that pain only held me back. But I've moved on. I've built a life for myself and for my children." Tunde nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "I know, I see that now. And I see how much you've done. I see the strength in you, the woman you've become. I'm proud of you, Ngozi. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished." There was a moment of silence between them, and for the first time, Tunde felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of forgiveness. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was the peace that came from understanding, from realizing that they had both moved on, that they had both found new paths, new lives, and that those paths no longer intersected. Ngozi glanced at the triplets, who were now playing with some of the other children at the event. They were laughing, carefree, and it warmed her heart to see them so happy. She turned back to Tunde. "You're right, I've built something for myself. And I'm not going to let the past define me anymore." Tunde's eyes softened. "I'm glad," he said, his voice quieter now. "You deserve happiness, Ngozi. You always did." The night wore on, and Tunde found himself lost in thought, watching Ngozi and her children from a distance. The event was a success, filled with laughter, generosity, and the warmth of people coming together for a good cause. But for Tunde, it was more than just a charity event. It was a final reckoning, a moment of truth where he faced the consequences of his actions and found a strange sense of peace in the resolution. What lessons did you take from Tunde and Ngozi's journey? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else see the power of forgiveness, redemption, and resilience. If stories like this touch your heart, make sure to follow our channel for more powerful, emotional tales that show how the truth can change everything. Thank you so much for watching Tunde and Ngozi's story all the way to the end. I hope it moved you as much as it did them. We've got many more unforgettable stories coming your way, so go ahead and click the video on your screen to discover the next one. You definitely won't want to miss it.